ready for a journey. Today, we're diving deep into medieval England, specifically the medical landscape, using some historical sources you sent in.
It's really interesting to look back and see how health was viewed back then. And when we think of medieval England, the Black Death is the first thing that pops into our heads. But as we'll see, the everyday reality was much more, well, complicated.
I'm all ears. So, if the plague wasn't public enemy number one, what were the top medical concerns?
So imagine like really bad stomach cramps and diarrhea, like constantly. That's dysentery. Or malaria, you're freezing and burning up at the same time. These were the daily dangers, just ravaging the population.
Yeah, those sound awful. Makes you appreciate a little 24-hour bug, doesn't it? It's hard to even imagine dealing with that without, modern medicine.
Yeah, and that lack of understanding really shaped their whole approach to health. They thought illness could be a punishment from God or bad air, an imbalance in the four humors, or get this, even caused by the stars.
Was stars? That's a new one. What can you tell me about these four humors?
Okay, so each humor was linked to both personality and health. Blood was warmth and cheerfulness, phlegm, cold and sluggishness. Then you have yellow bile, which was thought to be connected to anger and fire. And finally, black bile for melancholy and sadness.
So if someone was feeling down, they might have been diagnosed with like too much black bile.
Exactly. And to treat these imbalances, they used methods like bloodletting and purging, which, looking back, probably did more harm than good.
Bloodletting, that's hardcore. No wonder they were terrified of getting sick.
Right. And then you have things like the Black Death sweeping through Europe in the 1300s. Talk about fear.
The plague, devastating. I can't even imagine.
It wiped out something like 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Imagine the impact: communities disappearing, families torn apart. It shook the very core of society.
That's a massive number. Hard to fathom the impact. Was there anything good that came out of something so awful?
It's complicated, but there's evidence that because of the huge population decline, some people had better diets and living standards, more resources, and that may have helped slow down other diseases.
So some unexpected good came from this horrible plague.
It shows how even the worst times can have surprising results that shape the future. And it highlights how complex health and well-being really are.
Speaking of things that affect health, I'm curious about daily life in medieval England. What were their living conditions like?
Well, sanitation wasn't really a priority back then. People lived in crowded houses, often several generations altogether. And to make things worse, they lived with their livestock.
Wait, they lived with animals inside their houses?
Yeah, cows, pigs, chickens, you name it. It wasn't unusual to have them all under one roof. And then no refrigeration, no real waste disposal, and very little understanding of hygiene. You can see how disease spreads so easily.
Seems like a never-ending battle against dirt and germs. What did they do to, try and stay healthy?
They used what they had. They prayed for good health, carried sweet herbs like lavender to keep away bad smells. They believed those caused illness. And sometimes the government would actually make people clean the streets to try and improve things.
So they were starting to get that connection between cleanliness and health, even if they didn't fully understand it. I wonder if they would love, hand sanitizer.
Interesting thought. They were trying, but it wasn't anything like what we have today. And sadly, even with those efforts, many children didn't make it to adulthood. Disease was just too common, and infant and child mortality was it was a huge problem.
That's really sad to hear. It really puts things in perspective. Modern healthcare is something to be thankful for.
Absolutely. We often take it for granted, but remembering the struggles of the past makes you appreciate how far we've come.
We've talked about the diseases, their beliefs, and how they tried to stay healthy. What about treatment? Who were the healthcare providers in medieval England?
At the top, you had physicians, very educated, trained in the theories of the time, but expensive, so only the wealthy could afford them. Then there were apothecaries who they made and sold herbal remedies, kind of like pharmacists today.
Makes sense. Who did the surgeries and treated wounds?
That was the barber surgeons. Fascinating group. They did a wide range of things, from bloodletting and pulling teeth to treating wounds and setting broken bones.
Wow, a jack of all trades. Imagine getting your hair cut and a tooth pulled at the same place.
It was a completely different world. But let's not forget about the women who took care of the sick at home. Really important, providing comfort, basic care, emotional support. They used a lot of traditional remedies and their knowledge of herbal medicine.
Their work was vital, even if it wasn't formally recognized.
Absolutely. And the church was involved too. Some monasteries had cottage hospitals that gave basic care to the poor. They weren't fancy, but They were important for those who couldn't afford anything else.
It's fascinating how many different parts of society were involved in healthcare, even with their limited knowledge. They were constantly adapting, trying to care for themselves and their families.
Exactly. And as we dig deeper into this deep dive, we'll uncover even more about specific diseases, treatments, and the people who shaped this fascinating period in history.
I'm ready for more. This is already giving me a whole new view of healthcare history.
There's a lot more to come. Stick with us as we explore even more interesting details of daily life and healthcare in medieval England in part 2 of this deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into the health challenges of medieval England. We've already uncovered some fascinating things about their beliefs and practices, but now let's get into the nitty-gritty of their everyday lives.
I'm ready to go deeper. We talked about, people living in close quarters with their livestock, but can you paint a more vivid picture of what that was like?
Okay, so picture this. You're in a small, dimly lit house, and the air's thick with wood smoke, and maybe a few other smells, not so pleasant. Several generations of a family all crammed in this space, and right there with them are the animals, chickens running around, a pig snuffling in the corner, maybe even a cow trying to get out of the cold.
Wow, that's quite a scene. Not the cute cottage we usually think of when we hear medieval times. And no indoor plumbing, right?
Nope.
Yeah.
Forget about running water or flushing toilets. Waste disposal was, well, let's just say it was pretty basic. Often it was just tossed out into the street. Not exactly sanitary.
It's amazing how different their world was. It's hard to imagine, knowing what we know now about germs and sanitation, how anyone stayed healthy.
And that's a really important point. They didn't understand hygiene the way we do. Bathing wasn't a regular thing. Actually, it was sometimes seen as risky.
Risky? How so?
They thought that opening up your pores by bathing would make you more likely to get sick.
So they were afraid of getting clean. That's interesting.
It sounds weird to us, but it made sense to them, given what they knew about the body. They did wash their hands and faces, but not nearly as often or as thoroughly as we do.
A good reminder that you have to think about the context when you're looking at history. Speaking of context, what about food? What did people eat?
Well, like you might expect, diet varied a lot depending on social class and how much food was available. Rich people ate a lot of meat, especially wild game. They also had fresh produce, fancy wines, and spices from faraway places. Food was like a status symbol for them, a way to show off.
Sounds pretty good. But I guess it was different for, the average person.
Yeah, for most people, food was much simpler and often not enough. Bread was the main thing, with whatever vegetables they could grow or find. Meat was a luxury and often preserved by salting or smoking. It worked, but it didn't always taste great.
Not exactly the balanced diets we try to have today. I'd imagine that lack of nutrition really impacted their health.
Definitely. Malnutrition weakens the body, making you much more vulnerable to illness. It's a vicious cycle. Poor sanitation leads to disease. Malnutrition weakens the body, making it easier to get sick again.
It really shows how connected all these factors are. It's incredible how much we've learned since then about health and hygiene. It's pretty amazing what science and public health can do.
It is. And understanding the challenges of the past can help us appreciate what we have and guide our efforts moving forward.
We talked about women's roles in healthcare. Could you tell me more about that?
So as we discussed, formal health care was, well, mostly out of reach for most people, especially the poor. So women often took care of the sick at home.
It sounds like they were the backbone of the healthcare system, even without, official training.
Exactly. They had a ton of knowledge about traditional remedies, herbal medicine, basic nursing care. They were the caregivers for their families and communities and passed that knowledge down through the generations.
It's too bad their stories don't get told more often in history books. They were so important.
Totally agree. Their role shows that healthcare was, a team effort, even in really difficult times. And it's important to recognize that, to value what women have contributed to medicine throughout history.
This deep dive is really giving me such a clear picture of medieval England. We've covered a lot already, but I want to hear more about the specific diseases they faced and the treatments they used.
I know, it's fascinating stuff. And that's exactly where we're going next. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of those diseases that plagued medieval England, how they understood illness, and some of the, well, sometimes strange treatments they tried.
Welcome back to our deep dive into medieval England's health. So I'm ready to hear more about those specific diseases and how people tried to deal with them.
It's pretty amazing, right? Like, we take so much for granted these days with modern medicine. Today, we're going to look at some common illnesses that would have been a really big deal back then. Let's start with something you might not expect: toothaches.
Toothaches. Seriously. I wouldn't have thought those were a major problem. I mean, their diets were pretty basic.
Yeah, you'd think so, but their food, lots of bread, not many fruits and veggies, it actually caused a lot of tooth decay and abscesses. And don't forget, they didn't exactly have our understanding of dental hygiene.
So what did they do about toothaches? Did they have, like, dentists?
Not really. Remember the barber surgeons we talked
No.
about? Well, tooth pulling was one of their many skills.
Yeah.
Just imagine getting a tooth pulled with no pain relief.
Ouch. I think I'd rather have the toothache. What about other diseases? We mentioned smallpox. That one sounds especially scary.
Smallpox was, yeah, it was a terrifying reality for people in medieval England. Extremely contagious, high fever, those painful pustules all over the body, and often left survivors with, permanent scars.
It's amazing to think that we've completely gotten rid of that disease with vaccines. It really shows what modern medicine can do.
Absolutely. It's a huge achievement. Now let's talk about another disease that had a huge impact on medieval society: leprosy.
Right, leprosy. That was a big one, wasn't it? People were really afraid of it and misunderstood it too.
Yeah, leprosy caused a lot of fear and misunderstanding. It's a bacterial infection that can affect the skin, nerves, and even cause disfigurement. But back then, people didn't know what caused it, so they often saw it as a punishment from God or a sign of being unclean.
So how were people with leprosy treated?
It's really sad. People with leprosy were often shunned and forced to live in separate communities, isolated from everyone else. A heartbreaking example of what happens when you don't have scientific understanding. It can lead to prejudice and people being completely cut off from society.
It's a good reminder that we always need to be careful and separate facts from fear, even today. Let's change gears a bit and talk about their beliefs about illness and treatment. We talked about the four humors and those treatments like bloodletting and purging. What else did they do?
Well, religion played a big part in their healthcare. They believed illness could be God's punishment, so prayer was like their first line of defense, a way to seek healing and stay healthy.
That makes sense given their beliefs. So what did they do when, prayer wasn't enough?
They relied a lot on remedies made from herbs, plants, sometimes even animal parts. Some of these remedies might seem kind of odd to us today, but, well, they were doing the best they could.
Can you give me an example? What's one of those unusual remedies?
Sure. For epilepsy, they believed that wearing a necklace made from peony root would prevent seizures. And for headaches, they would put a plaster of crushed snails on their foreheads.
Crushed snails. You definitely won't find that at the drugstore. But does any of the remedies actually work?
It's interesting. Some of their herbal remedies actually did have real medicinal benefits, like they used willow bark to relieve pain and fever. And we know now that willow bark contains salicylic acid, which is very similar to what's in aspirin.
So even though their understanding was limited, they were still able to make some important discoveries through observation and trying things out.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that they passed down their knowledge of herbal medicine for generations. So it was a valuable source of traditional wisdom. A lot of the medicines we have today actually come from plants that have been used in traditional healing for a really long time.
That's such a fascinating connection between old remedies and modern medicine. Shows how scientific progress builds on what came before.
Hmm. Couldn't have said it better myself. And as we wrap up our deep dive into medieval England's health, I think it's important to remember how resilient those people were. Their health and well-being were constantly threatened, but they kept going. They adapted. They found ways to take care of themselves and each other.
Their story is really inspiring, a testament to the human spirit and our desire to be healthy. This has been such a journey, and I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the history of healthcare.
That's great to hear. And before we sign off, here's something for you to think about. If you could go back in time to medieval England, what advice would you give them about health and hygiene? What would you tell them to help them face those challenges?
That's a really great question for everyone listening. It really makes you think about how far we've come and how important it is to keep learning and growing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into medieval England's health. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay healthy.